I don't really talk about it much on my channel, barely at all, but I've been pretty into skateboarding since I was like 10 years old. Took a little hiatus for like 20 years, but let's ignore that. I started skating right before the Tony Hawk series really blew up, and at that point in time, skateboarding started permeating pop culture, maybe more so than it ever did, or has since. The fact that the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater games got as mainstream successful as they did wasn't something I could have really seen coming. Even in hindsight, it's surprising, and they certainly aren't the first skateboarding games to have existed. That being said, their breakaway from traditional racing-type gameplay and adoption of sandbox-level, objective-based progression, honestly mirroring collectathons more than anything, apparently was the golden ticket to making a really fun skateboarding game. And like with any game series, when you have a formula that successful, you're bound to have imitators. Over the years, there have been plenty of other studios who tried to capture that same magic, or at the very least capitalize on it, and I've gone my entire life not having played most of them. Today I aim to change that for whatever reason, so come with me as I embark on an arduous journey across a whole bunch of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater ripoffs/clones. But first, I couldn't have had a more perfect sponsor for this video. Proper hydration is super important when you do activities like skateboarding, so let's take a minute to talk about this video's sponsor, Liquid I.V. I've been pretty big on electrolytes over the past couple years, so I'm super excited about this brand, as electrolyte blends are something I believe in and have been using on my own for a while now. Proper hydration is really important, especially when you're doing intense physical activity like skateboarding, working out, or really any kind of exercise at all. Electrolytes like sodium and potassium are very important for proper hydration, and they help your body actually utilize the water that you drink. But many typical sports drinks you'd find at the convenience store are not only usually loaded with way too much sugar, but they also tend to have a pretty weak electrolyte blend. Liquid I.V.'s Hydration Multiplier electrolyte drink mix is different. One stick added to your normal water gives you 2 times faster hydration than water alone, and contains 3 times the electrolytes of traditional sports drinks. It also has 5 essential vitamins: B3, B5, B6, B12, and vitamin C. On top of all that, it tastes really good. I've been drinking their grape flavor lately, and after trying a lot of different electrolyte blends, this is by far the best tasting, and it's become a must-have when I skate or go to the gym or anything. It's also great for a really hot day, traveling, or just general wellness. If you want to try Liquid I.V.'s incredible Hydration Multiplier flavors while also helping out my channel in the process, click the link below or use my code gillythekid for 20% off plus free shipping. And thanks again to Liquid I.V. for sponsoring the video. So, the rules that I'm going to set here, I already know I'm going to immediately break, because what actually constitutes a Tony Hawk clone is kind of murky. It can't just be any old skateboarding game, because not only would that be inaccurate, but we'd be here all day. It also can't be every single extreme sports game that controls and has a progression system like the Tony Hawk games, because, once again, we'd be here all day, and some of them are actually published or developed by teams who worked on Tony Hawk, so at that point, is it really a ripoff? I think I'm gonna be loose with my definition here, but it needs to first and foremost either be a straight-up skateboarding game, or it needs to so closely mimic the Tony Hawk formula that it can't be ignored. Also, no bikes. This needs to either be some kind of riding plank, or it needs to technically qualify as a skating game. It's not called Tony Hawk's Pro Skateboarder, after all, so it's skate. And one last rule, which I'm making up for myself for reasons you'll see in a minute: if I include something that can't possibly be a ripoff due to release dates, it needs to somehow have ties to another game that would qualify as taking inspiration from Tony Hawk. Sounds like a foolproof list of criteria, right? All right, cool, let's go. I'm going to start off with something that kind of sort of breaks most of the rules I just laid out, but if I don't talk about this one first, it won't make a whole lot of sense to talk about another game on this list. So, let's just rip the band-aid off. Street Skater was released for the PS1 by EA in February of 1999, making it, yes, about a half a year older than the first Tony Hawk's Pro Skater game. So, to address the elephant in the room, technically, no, this can't actually be a ripoff. It is, however, similar in a lot of ways to Tony Hawk. Unlike the objective-based progression system Tony Hawk would come to be known for, we have score-based progression, but weirdly done in a pretty ungraceful way. To be fair, I'm sure nobody really knew how to make skateboarding games, much less make them fun. And as far as I know, this was one of, if not the first home console skateboarding game since the NES, so it's unsurprising that it would be rough around the edges and not exactly sure of itself. See, Street Skater has some of the skate park Tony Hawk-esque obstacles, but they're strewn about each stage, of which there are only 3, not counting bonus stages. Unlike having a big sandbox like most of Tony Hawk's stages, this game is more akin to Downhill Jam from Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1, where you're on a set linear path to a finish line with obstacles on the way to the goal.
The objective in each stage is simple. You need to get a certain number of points before making it to the finish line. Seems simple enough, but you'll be wrestling with the controls for dear life for 90% of the time. It strangely controls a little similar to Tony Hawk, holding down a button to crouch, which makes you accelerate faster, but unlike Tony Hawk, there's a separate button entirely that ollieing is mapped to. It's also like kind of a crapshoot to execute tricks. Now, I read through the controls just to make sure I wasn't doing anything wrong, but still, it seems like the game just kind of does whatever it wants. Different tricks are mapped to different directions on the D-pad, but I swear, there were tons of times where I would input the exact same button combinations and did completely different tricks. Or I used different button combinations and ended up doing the same trick, which is frustrating considering that more you do the same trick on the same obstacle, the less that trick starts to be worth. And with grind specifically, nothing seems to make sense as you can just hop on a rail and seemingly do whatever grind the game decides it wants you to do. Controlling the character is also like trudging through molasses, making it very easy to bump into things by accident, which, by the way, knocks you down and subtracts points if you so much as collide with a tiny pebble, which, come to think of it, I guess is very similar to actual skateboarding. Like I said, there are only 3 stages, so if you're good, you can actually beat the entire game in like 20 minutes. If it's your first time, though, you may get lucky and breeze through it, or what's more likely, if you're me, you may end up repeating the last stage 48 times, rubbing your face every time you realize you've failed the stage by only a few points again. For me, the game took maybe an hour, but most of that time was spent on the final stage. When I say you might get lucky, I don't mean you might accidentally play well. I mean, the game might give you a good RNG roll on whether or not it decides to read your inputs correctly, and that also the game's collision might decide to work as intended. I can't tell you the amount of times I tried to do a trick off a ramp only for the game to just be like, nah. See, you can only do tricks off specific obstacles, and there must be some kind of invisible zone on each ramp that's responsible for the window that you're able to input a trick, but sometimes the game just doesn't register anything. This wouldn't be as irritating, though, if it wasn't for the fact that the game is extremely unforgiving when it comes to racking up points. And you pretty much need to hit most of, if not all, the obstacles to actually be able to rack up enough points to complete the level. And since the stages are linear, if you miss one, oops! Oh, and that brings me to my favorite feature. You can't just restart a stage. If you realize you've squandered too much time or you've missed too many obstacles, the only options are to either let the timer run out, skate to the end of the stage, or quit all the way back to the main menu. Absolutely psychotic design choice. Outside of that, there's a few bonus stages that just consist of a single half-pipe or bowl, and once you complete the game, you open up alternate paths within the stages, but that ultimately doesn't help you with anything, considering the object of the game isn't actually to race to the end as fast as possible, so I'm not sure what the thought process was here. This is also one of the games where actual skaters aren't featured, but just some random original characters with different stats. You can choose your deck too, but the only one I actually recognize is this Powell board, so I'm pretty sure the rest are just original to the game, which is weird that they would then include the Powell graphic at all. It features a few different bands. I'm not really fond of any of the tracks I heard, but also, unlike Tony Hawk, where the game cycles through a playlist of songs, the game has one specific song per stage, meaning if you need to keep replaying a stage, you need to hear the same song over and over and over. God bless. I really want to give Street Skater the benefit of the doubt since it didn't really have anything to go off, but there's just a lot of design choices here that wouldn't be good for any video game, not necessarily skateboarding specifically. I sort of get what it tried to do, but this is just really not fun. It's also surprisingly short, which for me I'm thankful for, but for a kid in 1999 who just got the game, I'd be pretty pissed. In November of 1999, about a month after the first Tony Hawk's Pro Skater game would release, an ambitious yet ultimately doomed game would come out for the PS1. Thrasher, the biggest skateboarding magazine of all time, still going strong today, for better or for worse, teamed up with Rockstar Games to bring the world Thrasher Skate and Destroy. A game not unlike Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, but leaning far more into the kind of realistic physics you'd see today in something like the Skate series. Once again, this can't really be called a ripoff since this game and Tony Hawk 1 were in development at the exact same time. But I'm sure plenty of kids at the time played Tony Hawk, loved it, didn't know any better, went out and got this game thinking it was going to be another cool skateboarding game, only to realize it's, well, in my opinion anyway, a pile of flamin' hot dog shit. First off, much like many skateboarding games, even Tony Hawk to some degree, Thrasher Skate and Destroy revolves around the goal of racking up a specific amount of points in a certain amount of time. Where this game differs though, and I will admit this is actually kind of a unique mechanic, is that when the timer runs out in each stage, your run doesn't just end. See, there are different exit points in each of the stages that let you end the level before the timer runs out. So typically, if you rack up enough points, you can just end your run. However, if the timer runs out, you start getting chased by either the cops, a mugger, or an angry dog, depending on the level. I could only play this god-awful game for a few stages, so I never got to experience the latter two, but the inclusion of the cop in the stages I did play were not only kind of fun, but added an extra mechanic to the game overall. See, when you start getting chased down, you can either skate away and evade them, which results in the stage just ending, or you can try to do tricks as you're being chased. This is harder than landing tricks during normal play because the camera changes perspective from the skater to a first-person perspective of the one chasing you down. Because of this, landing tricks under these conditions results in a score multiplier, so you can actually use this as a Hail Mary if you didn't rack up enough points in time. If you happen to get caught, though, terrible things happen, like getting a stun gun to the ass. Once again, there's no actual pro skaters in this game, and instead, despite actually having one of the biggest names in skateboarding attached to it, we yet again have a bunch of original characters, all of which and I'm sure none of you care about. Now, in concept, this game seems pretty neat and unique enough to set itself apart from the Tony Hawk series. In execution, however, it's a dumpster fire. I know I ragged on the first game for controlling badly, but dear Lord, I didn't realize how bad it could get. I spend way more time having my body thrown around the stages with ragdoll physics than I ever do actually landing tricks. If you so much as bump into something wrong, the game will send you flying, and it takes 27 centuries to actually get back up, which makes the, quite frankly, short amount of time you have to rack up a high score that much more demanding. It is like pulling teeth trying to do anything in this game. Not only are the controls slow and unresponsive, but they made this bizarre control scheme choice that makes everything 500 times harder than it needs to be. So, for example, you know how in Tony Hawk you hold down one button to crouch and accelerate and release the same button to ollie and then press another button to start a grind? Well, in this game, you use one button to push or accelerate, in this case the cross button, and then square to actually ollie, and then press cross again to grind. Not only is jumping around like this extremely cumbersome and honestly pretty confusing, but it leads to weird situations where you'll randomly start grinding things you didn't mean to, if you happen to be riding on a surface that has collision programmed to be able to be grinded. Now, the stage I gave up on was the first tournament stage. Much like the rest of the stages and the tournaments in the Tony Hawk games, the goal is just to rack up a score. In this game, you get docked lots of points for bailing, which, like I said, is pretty hard not to do. Each stage requires higher and higher scores to progress, and doing the same tricks over and over decreases their score value, but on a per-obstacle basis like in the previous game I talked about. And unlike Tony Hawk, you don't have all the basic tricks at your disposal and instead unlock them as you progress, giving you more opportunities to be able to rack up your score. The difficulty of the game doesn't scale properly with the tricks you unlock. You'd think this would give you more opportunities to spam more and more tricks, but since pulling off literally any trick at all is difficult, the fact that you have all these extra tricks doesn't really make up for the fact that the time you're actually given is so short. This game honestly sucks. It sucks hard. I don't know what people see in this thing that I don't, but I needed to put it down because of just how agitated I was getting. I feel like even if I was super good at the game, it just isn't fun to play. Also doesn't help that, like the previous game I talked about, I had to keep listening to the same 2 or 3 songs over and over. I can only listen to King of Rock by Run DMC so many times in a row. Hey, real quick, if you find yourself enjoying this video, consider subscribing if you aren't already. I know a lot of you are tired of hearing it, but it really does help this channel out a lot, especially as I've started doing these long-form videos. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Now back to the video. And here's the reason I felt compelled to bring up the first game. About a year later, after the release of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, EA would make a follow-up to Street Skater called Street Skater 2. The format is a lot like the first game, but you can tell they took more than a few cues this time around after the reception of Tony Hawk. Now, I'm not going to say this game is great or anything. It still does control pretty poorly, but that being said, it's easily leagues better than the first game. This time around, the format is much the same. Get a certain amount of points before making it to the end of each course, with obstacles scattered throughout. But this game, not only does it control quite a bit better, but it also looks a lot better. And there's a lot more to do. It's just designed a whole lot better in terms of where and how many obstacles are put in your path. In the first game, you really don't want to spend too much time on one single obstacle because that will drain your time, but more often than not, the game isn't really designed to hit the same obstacle over and over, and there's a lot of easily missable ramps and rails. Street Skater 2 opens up a little more of the skate park areas and makes it a little more seamless to spend more time in a certain area before making your way to the next checkpoint. It definitely feels a lot more natural. The first game did have like one or two branching paths that you had to, for some reason, unlock, and then unlocking them did literally nothing for you besides just going a different direction for no reason. But in Street Skater 2, the levels have quite a few different routes you can take, all offering different options for obstacles, which definitely does keep the levels a bit more fresh. The different paths always funnel you back to one main route, but my only issue is that sometimes it's hard to figure out where the next checkpoint is. Once you find it, you know where it is, but considering you're on a timer, playing around in these skate park areas can sometimes be risky, because after that, you actually need to poke around and figure out where the main path forward is again. It's not a super big deal, but I definitely wasted too much time and failed a level a handful of times just because I had no idea where I was supposed to go. There's also these gems you can collect which add to your overall score as well, making it a lot less of a struggle to reach each level's goal points. I will admit though, despite the controls being quite a bit more responsive, the button combination choices are very weird. They're actually a little closer to a Tony Hawk control scheme, but they made these weird choices like mapping grabs to every face button except cross, and needing to press triangle and a shoulder button to perform different grinds. It's pretty cumbersome and hard to remember what the button combinations are for different tricks, so considering you can only do so many tricks at a time anyway, I ended up just spamming the same tricks over and over, and it makes literally no difference because every time you hit a new obstacle, the point values are refreshed, so you don't have much of a chance to get punished for overusing tricks. The game is also extremely short, but I'm pretty sure the number of levels are either comparable to or haven't changed since the prior game. There's still bonus stages in between, but I think it's just a lowered level of difficulty, likely as a result of the controls not being quite as horrible. The first game, I think, had the same number of stages, but I kept struggling to beat levels, so it took me like an hour. I beat this game's campaign in like 20 minutes. That being said, the game does start you out on easy mode, and as you beat each campaign, another difficulty becomes available. That's fine, I guess, for replayability, but it feels like they just padded the game's length out by gatekeeping different difficulties instead of just making more stages. And speaking of stages, this game actually came out quite a few months before Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, and it has a park editor. Albeit not a very good park editor, mind you, but it is there, and it gives you a decent amount of obstacles to choose from. Unfortunately, though, you can't pick the size or theme of the park, so it's pretty bare bones. It's a nice feature to have, but ultimately pretty underwhelming. They still haven't signed any deals with any pros, so you got the original characters again, which is fine, and once again, we have a bunch of PAL boards. Apparently, PAL was like the only skate company they could get on board for this, I guess. I will say the levels are definitely a lot more visually interesting this time, especially the Russia level that has a bunch of tanks and stuff. It seems like they took quite a bit more time fleshing out the themes of these levels compared to the first game that just looks like the most generic skateboarding game you've ever seen. All in all, Street Skater 2 is miles better than the first game. It's nothing I'd call good necessarily, and it's not something I'll ever feel the urge to return to, but at the very least it's harmless and nowhere near as egregious as the first game was. My only main gripe is just how short the game is. It's padded out a little bit by the unlockable difficulties, park editor, and the fact that you can play multiplayer, but when this was brand new, the amount of content here definitely didn't cut it, especially considering they must have had some bit of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater influence. Another game predating Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, I think this is the first game on this list that actually fully is a Tony Hawk clone. No exceptions, no bending of the rules, just a straight-up carbon copy of most of the DNA that makes up the Tony Hawk games. Grind Session was a creation of Shaba Games, who weirdly actually started development of this game before the first Tony Hawk game's release, and who would in later years become the ones to create the last-gen version of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 for the PS1, Tony Hawk's Underground 2 Remix for PSP, as well as Project 8 for PS2. Safe to say, this game didn't exactly work out for them, at least not in terms of creating a successful series. It more or less became a portfolio for future work with the Tony Hawk series itself. In any case, this is the first game I'm going to talk about today that actually features real pro skaters. Notable standouts being Daewon Song, who himself wouldn't show up in a Tony Hawk game until American Wasteland, and who, funny enough, is featured here as riding for his ill-fated brand Deca Skateboards, of which I actually still own the promo tape for. Also featured in Grind Session is Ed Templeton, the founder of Toy Machine Skateboards. The roster here isn't big, but it definitely is notable for the era this game came out in, and features some interesting choices not found in the Tony Hawk games. In any case, like I said, Grind Session is, for all intents and purposes, a Tony Hawk clone, even featuring Burnside Skate Park, which was also in Tony Hawk 1, which is actually a real skate park that I recently dragged Ant Dude, Connor the Waffle, and the guys from Sunset City to so I could stand on top of a quarter pipe and watch people skate for an hour because I didn't bring my board to Portland. It's a Tony Hawk clone, but it's a Tony Hawk clone mostly in terms of its presentation and controls, which pretty closely mirror Tony Hawk's. It's not one-to-one because different tricks sometimes do call for different button combinations, but the ollie, flip trick, grab trick, and grind buttons are all found in the same place the Tony Hawk games map them. Where this game deviates from closely resembling Tony Hawk's Pro Skater is in its objectives and progression system. See, in Grind Session, instead of having a long checklist of different goals, there's a few different things you need to do, and you gradually get more and more progression points as you chip away at them, which in this game are called respect or respect points. Each new level needs a certain amount of respect to unlock, and as you chip away at objectives, you earn more. There's a pro score, where hitting a certain high score earns you a point, and then increasing your score from there earns you more until you cap out. Another objective not too dissimilar to objectives you'd find in the Tony Hawk series is the ones where you need to destroy or knock over a certain number of specific objects in a stage. This differs from Tony Hawk, though, because unlike having one single goal of knocking over all 10 of something, you instead get respect points for each one you knock over, gradually earning you more and more each time, but it resets each time you retry. The final objective, which is the most interesting, but also the most frustrating in terms of completion, is the technical line objective. Each stage has different gaps or special lines like in the Tony Hawk games, only you can actually see them by pressing L2. Each completed gap earns you a respect point, and you need to hit all 10 in one run to receive full completion. It's actually a super cool idea, but more often than not, getting all 10 is actually really hard. Not impossible, but not something you're going to just breeze through without practicing. Like the Tony Hawk games, there are also contest levels where you compete for the high score in 3 different categories. One being just a general full park high score, one relegated to only transition skating or vert, and one for best trick. Best trick, in my opinion, being the most difficult because you only get one attempt. Skate contests in real life give you more than one attempt. Luckily, your best trick score seems to not influence your overall ranking all that much, so you can likely manage to mess up and still place. Probably the coolest thing about this game is that once you beat it, you get access to the mansion, but all the different areas in the mansion are gated behind a series of locked doors. There's a key icon on the screen for each one of the stages in the game, and once you fully complete a stage, it gives you access to one of these areas within the mansion. Once you enter each of the rooms in the mansion, you can collect these floating gold coins. Once all of them are collected, you unlock a secret character who has all maxed out stats, which in this game can't be increased for other characters since they all have their own fixed stats. Other secret characters are also unlocked each time you beat the game with each respective skater. Honestly, I would totally say this game is worth playing. It's actually pretty damn good, and I wish I'd known about it at the time it came out. I will say, it feels ever so slightly less polished than Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, but it's fun, controls surprisingly well, and has a good amount of content and unlockables in it. If you're itching for another Tony Hawk game and you've never played Grind Session, I'd definitely check it out. It's a shame this game never kicked off a continuing series, because this game with the most ass-looking, unassuming cover is actually pretty good. In 2000, THQ would partner up with MTV to produce a skateboarding game, very obviously trying to capture the magic of what attracted people to the Pro Skater series. How do you make a successful skateboarding game post-Tony Hawk? Get yourself your very own popular professional vert skater, slap him on the cover, and fill your game's roster with a bunch of other popular pro skaters. Forget about, making the game good or fun. Once again, we have another game that, on paper, should control like the Tony Hawk games. In all actuality, though, it doesn't, at all. If you look at the controller layout, it's very similar to Tony Hawk, but I can't really explain it through words without having someone actually take the controller to feel what I mean. I feel like about 60% of the time, the game just does not respond to your button inputs, or sometimes even just responds to them late. You'll try to do a kickflip, and then you need to press the button 4 times before it actually starts to flip. And by that point, you're too close to the ground and usually end up eating shit. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry, but this one's particularly bad, and I played the whole stupid game. The main campaign, anyway. So unlike the checklist objective type of progression the Tony Hawk series is known for, pretend they made an entire Tony Hawk game out of just the contest levels, but instead of multiple heats, you just get one. every single stage. Literally, the only thing you do in this game is compete in one contest per stage, and every once in a while, a photo shoot level pops up where you need to do the exact same thing you do in all the other stages, except collect X number of photos that are scattered throughout the level. Now, the way contests are set up really don't make any sense at all. It tells you not to fall and to have trick variety, but pretty much everything except big huck and vert tricks get you f*** all for points. So the best strategy to beating this game is to literally ignore every obstacle in the stage that isn't a quarter pipe or half pipe. It makes sense for Andy McDonald, but absolutely no sense for skaters like Rick Howard and Stevie Williams, two huge names in street skating. But don't worry, because I forgot to mention, you can't even skate as any of the real-life pros in the main campaign, and playing as them is reserved only for the side mode. For the main campaign, you have to play as one of the made-up skaters, like Anna Graham. Anyway, you go through each level spamming grab tricks with as many spins as you can manage, and as long as you don't fall too many times, you're pretty much guaranteed to progress to the next stage. It took me a while to get into the groove of the controls, which at best, once you really get a feel for them, are still god-awful and sluggish. At first, you're probably going to fall 8,000 times trying to get the hang of it, but you'll learn quickly through negative reinforcement, because every single time you fall, this happens. In between each stage, you'll be greeted by various unnamed women who are just on the screen for seemingly no reason, and the text will tell you about whatever the goal that needs to be met for the next stage is. It's rinse and repeat until you finally beat the game and get access to a secret stage, as well as a hidden character. There's a couple other modes, but there's even less of a reason to bother with them than the main campaign. There's one where you need to collect a bunch of MTV emblems, basically taking the worst part of the game and making an entire mode out of it. Only this time, every time you fall down, you lose one of them. Have fun. There's also another mode where you have a limited amount of time and get seconds added onto the timer for each trick that you do, with the goal of seeing how long you can last before the timer runs out. This would probably be the most enjoyable mode if not for the fact that the controls mostly don't work, and the more you spam the same tricks, the less time they're worth. There's one more mode here that would have been promising if not for the fact that it's unsurprisingly just as janky and broken as the rest of the game. It's this mode where you get thrown in front of various big ramps and need to both clear the giant gap while also hitting a certain amount of points for whichever trick you do over it. Problem is, I could be wrong, but I'm almost positive that some skaters literally cannot physically make it over these gaps. I tried playing as Rick Howard, a street skater with street skater stats, and no matter how many times I tried, I couldn't even come close to making it over this mega ramp gap. I realized that I probably needed to switch characters to someone with more appropriate stats, so naturally, I had to switch to the king of the mega ramp, Jimmy Sweetlove. Now, I was able to make it over the gap, but just barely, and by the third stage, I couldn't do it anymore. This game is bad, and poor Andy McDonald and his trademark yellow shirt and helmet are now forever plastered on the cover of an absolute dumpster fire. I'm not sure if he had lofty dreams about having his own successful series or if he was just secure in the bag, but either way, this is one of the worst skateboarding games I've ever played, and it's a shame there's quite a few pros in here that were only ever featured in this game. MTV Sports Skateboarding featuring Andy McDonald is a not good. Following the less than stellar sales of Grind Session, Shaba Games gave this whole Tony Hawk-esque extreme sports video game thing the old college try one more time, and decided to repurpose the Grind Session engine, partner up with Razor Scooters for brand recognition, and make a freestyle scooter game more in the vein of the Tony Hawk series in terms of its objectives, but this time around, obviously geared at a younger audience with a more kid-friendly art style, steering away from realism and embracing things like cartoony proportions. However, not only is this game severely lacking in content, as we'll get into in a second, but they seemingly broke the engine somewhere in the process of converting the physics to be a scooter game. All the controls are relatively the same, only transposed into scooter tricks, of which, if you're unfamiliar with the two sports, there are much, much less of. I don't want to go on a scooter rant, but all I'll say is, regardless of skill and difficulty of the tricks, there are just way less possibilities with a scooter. The variations, options, and combinations as far as tricks go are just nowhere near as vast as with skateboarding, and this definitely shows even in something like a scooter video game. It's much harder to combo tricks, and overall it just feels much more restrictive than something like Tony Hawk, but I digress, back to these controls. I don't really know what happened here, because Grind Session actually controlled surprisingly well, to the point where I was a bit taken aback. This, however, for whatever reason, feels extremely slow. The turning is somehow always not enough or way too much, and the only way to really get any kind of precision when trying to line yourself up with an obstacle is to just straight up stop and then aim. All the tricks take like 10 years to perform, so trying to do simple tricks in between chaining grinds for combos is virtually impossible, and the only way to really rack up any points is to get a ton of speed and then air out of a quarter pipe so you have enough hang time to actually spam a few tricks. Which is also a huge pain in the ass, because it's really difficult to get any kind of real speed in this game, and the second you hit the ground a little off, you lose literally all your momentum. I don't know how they took a perfectly functioning and well-controlling engine and turned it into this. But enough about the controls. This game has your typical checklist-based progression system, much like the Tony Hawk games, only with a lot less variety. It even has a story, too. You're a kid, and a bunch of your stupid friends got kidnapped by a robot or something. That's it. Go crazy. Go save them or whatever, I guess. The game's goals are par for the course. You can assume what they are. It's the high score objective, collect all the thing objective, which in this game are scooter wheels, grind a certain distance, get X amount of points for a combo, those kinds of things. And they're exactly the same for every stage, only changing in the numerical values needed per stage, which, by the way, in this game, there are only 3 of. This game has 3 stages, and they're all designed like shit. I have no idea how these guys who made Grind Session, a game whose levels were actually pretty well laid out and designed, went on to make this. I feel like this was their one last hurrah to try and make a game that was successful, so they just leaned into the novelty of it and marketed it towards kids that didn't actually want to put in the effort anymore since they got burned by Grind Session. Who knows, though? All I know is this game isn't only lacking the polish seen in Grind Session, but is severely lacking in, game. The only other stages that exist are these challenge levels, which is how you rescue each of your friends who then become playable characters once they're rescued. These stages are unlocked by completing objectives, but these aren't even actually stages. They're just these little self-contained collect all the wheels challenges, which for whatever reason take place 30,000 feet in the air. Apparently, after you rescue all your friends, that's how you actually beat the game, but I'm not going to sit here grinding away trying to get all these objectives completed. In any case, once you save all of them, you use a shrink ray on the giant robot and find out he actually kidnapped your friends because being big made him crazy. Okay. The version I played was on PS1, but surprisingly, not only did it come out for the N64 also, but the Dreamcast as well. I guess they were trying to cast a wide net, but I don't think that worked out too well. Really, what they should have done was just given Grind Session one last chance and made a sequel, but unfortunately, we got this instead. It's definitely not the worst game of this specific style, and it does control better than a lot of the games I played, but to be fair, the bar is really not very high at all. The controls aren't broken, but they do feel just god-awful, especially in comparison to the game this game was built on. I don't know what they were trying to do here, honestly. Like, there aren't even any extra game modes besides a practice mode and 2-player versus. Anyway, that's all I can possibly say about this game. There just isn't enough content here to really talk about it. If nothing more, it at least stands as a bit of history for the fate of the groundwork set by Grind Session and the team who worked on it. I straight up do not understand the history of this game. I genuinely do not know if it was even sold, like, in a store. I guess it was loosely based on an extremely goofy movie, but it didn't even come out until like a year and a half after that movie was out, so it's not like there was a promotional campaign going on. And weirdly enough, I do not know if this game was sold in stores. Apparently, a single stage demo came packed in with a box of Kellogg's cereal, which wasn't really uncommon for the time, but also, turns out, the full game was then also released via a pack of Purdue dinosaur chicken nuggets. This was a chicken nugget pack-in game. Unsurprisingly, the only thing extreme about extremely goofy skateboarding is how extremely terrible it is. You can play as either Goofy or Max, and for whatever reason, Goofy rides a longboard. I don't know why. You can also change up their clothes and helmet, which is a surprising feature considering just how much this game doesn't have to offer. There's 4 worlds with 3 levels each, and the objectives in every level are virtually identical. Save for a few instances, it's mostly just ride around each stage collecting things. Each stage has a coin collection mission, and then the typical Tony Hawk fare you'd see, like knocking over trash cans or the like, and you only need to complete 2 objectives in each stage to progress, as completing all of them does nothing to impact progression at all. After you finish 2 objectives, you then need to collect a key to open the door to the next world. Rinse and repeat 12 times. Now, you may have noticed that I mentioned nothing about doing tricks. That's because doing tricks literally does not matter and does nothing to impact the game at all. There are no high score objectives, no combo objectives, no nothing. The game tallies up your score, but it ultimately serves no purpose, which, to be honest, is kind of relieving because just navigating through these stages at all is a fucking nightmare. The game will out of nowhere speed you up at random with seemingly no rhyme or reason. Grinds have no momentum or balance involved at all. Trying to turn and aim yourself properly is also a whole issue in and of itself. It took me like 5 minutes just to be able to ride up this ramp to grab a stupid beach ball. Falling from too high also results in a bail, which, by the way, takes 12 fucking years to recover from. Just look how long this recovery animation lasts. The controls mirror Tony Hawk games, which by now is unsurprising, but everything is just sort of mapped to different buttons, and I swear sometimes there doesn't seem to be any method to the madness. Stuff just kind of happens, and a lot of the time, I won't be trying to do anything, but the game will try to do a trick anyway, and I'll eat shit. That's honestly really all there is to this game. I didn't even bother playing past the second world just because there was literally no point. I'd just be doing the same thing over and over again with a different coat of paint till I finished it all. And I already found out prior to playing the game that once you finish the final stage, it makes you collect a key just like all the other stages do to enter the next, only the final one just boots you back to the main menu. No unlockables, no hard mode, no credits, or even a "you did it" screen. Nothing. There's some extra modes, including a tutorial, a free skate mode, but that's about it. Now, there is one more mode called Tech Session, and it's basically a secondary version of the main campaign. This should have been the main campaign. The objectives actually are more skateboarding related, like high scores, gaps, the stuff that the initial game should have been about. Had no idea this was a thing till I already wasted my time with the main campaign. Why this isn't the primary campaign is baffling to me, but I've already given myself enough of a headache just with the amount I've already played. Though, I guess there's not much more I could have expected from a chicken nugget pack-in game. You ever play a game before that made you go, damn, this game would be pretty alright if it didn't suck shit? Well, that's ESPN X Games Skateboarding for the PS2. Made by Konami, this was a partnership between them and ESPN, using the X Games branding and throwing Bob Burnquist on the cover. Bob had just won the X Games, and with Tony Hawk retiring from the X Games, Bob was offered a chance to have his own game. Naturally, since this would be Bob Burnquist and ESPN's answer to the Tony Hawk series, Bob wouldn't appear in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 as he did in the first two games, but judging by the fact that he came back in Tony Hawk 4, I'm pretty sure you can assume how well this whole thing went for him. What is pretty cool though is that since this game actually featured real professional skaters in it, you get to see some faces not seen in the Tony Hawk games, including Rick McCrank, one of my favorite skaters growing up, who I've only really ever seen in one other skateboarding game, but we'll get to that in a bit. Now, the first mode on the main menu is this competition mode, which honestly isn't even the main focus or meat of the game, but I guess since this is an X Games branded game, they used the whole competing in the X Games thing as the first option. All it is a contest mode where you compete in both vert and park with 3 runs for each. The vert one is fine, similar to what you do in Tony Hawk. Spam flip tricks into grabs, and it's relatively easy to get gold. The park section, though, is where the cracks really start to show. The game controls like absolute dog shit. The controls are super unresponsive and unruly, and it's near impossible to play this game without unintentionally bumping into shit. It also doesn't help that for the park section, you actually need to use the whole park to get a good score, and you can't just spam tricks on the quarter pipes to rack your score up. Luckily, though, this isn't really the game's main mode. What is what this game calls arcade mode, which is literally a Tony Hawk clone. 6 stages with goals to complete for each. Unlike Tony Hawk, the goals for each stage are always identical in theme. There's 2 high scores to reach, a high combo goal, 6 checkpoints scattered throughout the stage, which are numbered and need to be hit in order, 5 random objects you need to destroy, and an X Games emblem you need to collect. And these are usually not in plain sight, similar to the secret tapes in Tony Hawk. This checklist is identical for every single stage, with the only thing changing being the high scores and combos. There are also hidden skate decks you can obtain for each character, and they're all hidden in different places depending on the character you're playing as. I thought this was actually a cool idea, but unfortunately, I couldn't reap the benefits of getting a cool new skate deck graphic because the emulator I was using to play the game on, for whatever reason, wouldn't load the textures for skateboards, so I had to stare at this eyesore for a couple hours. This game has a few cool things going for it, but it's all bogged down by the fact that it just controls so badly and you need to fight with the camera every step of the way. There's only 6 stages, but a few of them are pretty creative and imaginative, not dissimilar to the Tony Hawk games. Sure, there's normal city stages like New York and LA, but there's also some unique ones like the museum and the ruin stage. The levels are also a bit larger than they let on, with some areas not being accessible by just riding to them. Some can only be accessed by grinding a specific obstacle or using a ramp to get to them, but unfortunately, due to the controls, instead of these being cool and interesting, it's frustrating and annoying, especially when you need to access these areas to complete a goal. A lot of times there'll be something that should for all intents and purposes be easy, but due to the controls and camera will make you want to rip your hair out. Like in the museum stage, for example. There's one of these areas that can only be accessed if you grind across this dinosaur skeleton, but when you try to line up properly, the camera faces you instead of the obstacle, and doesn't turn around until you start riding. And to make matters worse, you immediately take off at the speed of light, giving you no chance to properly aim. I ran out of time multiple runs just trying to get across what should be an easy obstacle, and this blasting off at the speed of light thing is a problem in pretty much every single thing in the game that requires lining stuff up right. Like I said before, it's also super unresponsive. Sometimes you'll try to do something and it just won't happen. The turning is also not tight enough at all, even when you pick the loose trucks option, and the balancing stat is for whatever reason tied to your bearings. So if you want the best balance, you need to pick slow bearings, which, funnily enough, is completely antithetical to how it actually works in real life. I really don't know how they got this so wrong, because it seems like, at least as far as the levels go, they were sort of on the right track, but the controls just ruined the entire game. If the controls were fixed, this wouldn't be terrible, but unfortunately, it is terrible, and it's unsurprising that we never got another game with Bob Burnquist's name on it. This is probably the weirdest game I'm going to cover today, and not just for the fact that the board you ride on and it doesn't have wheels. It's really only vaguely a Tony Hawk ripoff, honestly. I still do want to cover it because I feel like there's enough Tony Hawk DNA in here to warrant it, but admittedly, this one is kind of a bit of a stretch, but it's a weird game, so whatever, let's talk about it. Published by Namco and developed by Criterion Games, yup, the Burnout guys, Airblade is an extremely short, narrative-driven hoverboard game. Now, the entire game is strung together by this very strange plot. See, when I first looked this game up, I thought it was just going to be some skateboarding game set in the future or whatever, so you're on a hoverboard. But in all actuality, though, the game's plot revolves entirely around said hoverboard. When you first boot up story mode, some dude gets whacked in the head and knocked out by some group of thugs looking to steal some mysterious package. Instead of letting them just take it, you snatch it up, and it's the eponymous Airblade, a hoverboard invented by your friend, the one who just got kidnapped. You jump on the Airblade, and now these same thugs are after you. Instead of a normal Tony Hawk-style checklist, the game throws an arrow at the top of the screen, pointing you in the direction of your goals. They range from attacking these bad guys, to destroying certain objects, like security devices, and reaching certain areas all within a time limit. Each time a goal is met, you get a little time bonus, and in between some of these goals, you get a cutscene which sometimes advances the plot, but mostly exists to point out the next goal. For example, in the first stage, the final goal is to reach your friend on the roof, but that area can't be reached until this helicopter knocks over a pylon conveyed to you in a cutscene, which can then be used to access that area. Now, this is pretty rinse and repeat for each stage, of which there are only 6. The game actually is really short, and according to How Long to Beat, it says it takes about 38 minutes to beat the game, which I would probably agree with for repeat playthroughs, but the first time around, you might end up running out of time and needing to redo entire stages, because, surprise, if you run out of time during one challenge, you need to start the entire stage all over again, which is very likely in a lot of cases, due almost entirely to the fact that because most of the time, those final get-to-the-area goals aren't conveyed super well. Not necessarily in terms of what you're supposed to do, but how you're supposed to do it. In the second stage, you need to reach this helicopter and grab onto it before time runs out, but you need to make a series of maneuvers to actually access it, and it isn't immediately obvious what you're supposed to do. This wouldn't be a problem if not for the time limit. Oh, that and the fact that it controls like shit. Starting to see a theme here. See, it does operate a lot like Tony Hawk in terms of how you do tricks. It's mapped similarly as well. The only real difference is that none of the tricks make any sense, and they're all either named random made-up stuff or they're just named incorrectly, but I can forgive all that. What I can't forgive is just how messy this game feels to play. First of all, I may be wrong, but as far as I can tell, you can't stop. You can't just stop and aim yourself in a direction. You're just constantly moving. Weirdly enough, you can randomly just about face on a dime, but you can't just stop. As far as how it feels to control, I want to say it feels floaty, but well, you know. Look, I get that it's a hoverboard game, but that shouldn't come at the expense of making the game feel bad to play. One of the game's main movement mechanics is the boost meter, which allows two things. Pressing the right trigger speeds you up while draining the meter, and holding the jump button while you jump enables you to jump higher, once again while draining the meter. The meter is refilled by doing tricks, and though this sounds like an okay system, there's really no point to it. What ends up happening is that you need to just spam flip tricks as you ride around, because unlike in Tony Hawk or any normal skateboarding game, since you're already hovering, you don't actually need to ollie or jump to initiate a flip trick, so you just literally ride around spamming flip tricks like it's going out of style. What makes it even more annoying is that because you're on a time limit, using the boost isn't something just relegated to making difficult jumps. If that were the case, that would actually be pretty cool, but because you're on such a strict time limit, you're shooting yourself in the foot if you don't spam boost. Because of this, you end up needing to do a bunch of tricks constantly, which adds to your score, but that score also ultimately doesn't fucking matter. I don't care how short this game is. I couldn't bear to play it more than halfway through, which, to be fair, really doesn't matter because you basically see everything this game has to offer during the first stage. It's an interesting game with a pretty on-the-nose, ridiculous story, and if I'm being fair, it probably could have been good, but it's just not worth playing. I'm glad Criterion dropped this game like a bad dream and started the Burnout series. So we're going to bounce over again to another thing that's not actually skateboarding, but I mean, these technically are skaters by dictionary definition anyway. Aggressive Inline was released in 2002 by Z-Axis, the same team who unfortunately made Thrasher Skate and Destroy, but also were the ones who started the Dave Mirra Freestyle BMX series, which in its own right had a few really good games, and contrary to Thrasher Skate and Destroy, also controlled and played well. Like I said, I won't be getting into any of those games because then I'd need to start including every sport, and we'd get into stuff like Sean Murray's Pro Wakeboarder, which at that point, not only am I straying far from the topic, but the game was branded under the blank's Pro blank name and publisher, so is it even a clone if it's from the same company? This actually came out before Tony Hawk 4, which is a little strange considering Tony Hawk 4 would go on to have some similarities shared with Aggressive Inline that it doesn't share with its previous entries. So the controls are unsurprisingly extremely close to what you'll find in Tony Hawk, only they've completely excluded what is normally the grab button. Not because the game is simplified or anything, but just due to the fact that inline skating just literally does not have as many tricks that exist as in skateboarding. To slightly make up for that though, there's some interesting added tricks, or mechanics really, to flesh it out a little more. Not only was skitching introduced, predating its first inclusion in Tony Hawk 4, but there's also some added tricks like vaulting or swinging on pipes or rails to chain combos together, along with cess slides, which are basically reverts in this game. Manuals, however, seem to be really unpredictable. They do exist and do work, when they want to anyway, and they operate exactly the same as in the Tony Hawk games. Unfortunately, even when using the D-pad to make sure I am absolutely 100% making correct inputs, sometimes manuals just seem to not happen. I'm not sure what's causing this, but it's actually super frustrating sometimes. It doesn't break the game or anything, but it definitely makes me less inclined to use them. Unlike the Tony Hawk games, your stats don't increase from gaining stat points to spend in whatever areas you want, but rather, your stats naturally increase as you play. The more you grind, the more you can grind. The more you jump, the more you'll ultimately be able to jump, that kind of thing. I don't know if I necessarily like this more than the point system, but it's something at least a little unique and does feel natural. So something I like a lot about this game, as opposed to the Tony Hawk games that came before it, is that there's no overall level timer. There is a meter on the HUD that depletes gradually and fills up as you do tricks, and once that completely empties, you get a game over, which is honestly an extremely weird system, but it rarely ever happens. Overall, though, the only thing that's timed are some of the challenges, which instead of only having 2 minutes to seek out and complete per run, you're thrown into the stage with free reign to just explore, find challenges, and complete them at your own pace. Some challenges are on the big challenge list in the pause menu, but others are initiated by talking to NPCs that are scattered throughout each stage, something the Tony Hawk series wouldn't do till later. A lot of these challenges are also these environmental ones which change up the layout of the stages or open up new areas. And I'm sounding like a broken record here, but also very similar to some of the stuff in the Tony Hawk series. This time around, though, because there's no level timer, you're free to explore these often huge stages which at first seem not exactly small, but not huge either, until you open up entire new areas of a stage and realize you were previously only exploring like half of it. It's very much collectathon-esque in these regards, and it keeps the game fresh, and it never really spends too much time in one area, so it never really starts to feel stale. Much like the Underground series, the NPCs are also very much characters and each have voiced lines that are actually kind of funny sometimes. The soundtrack is also pretty good. As soon as I booted the game up, the intro started while Crawling in the Dark by Hoobastank played, so I knew I was in for a treat. Although, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is not the first, or even the second, maybe even the third, extreme sports game to feature Sellout by Real Big Fish, and I think I could go the rest of my life without ever hearing that song again and I'd be okay. Anyway, there's plenty of other standard challenges like high scores, needing to hit X amount of a certain obstacle in a line, grind this specific thing, do a trick on this specific thing, do this trick over this specific gap. Standard stuff I'm sure you're used to by now, but if you like this kind of game, that's exactly what you're looking for anyway. As far as the characters go, I know literally nothing about inline skating, so these could be pros or original characters and I would have no idea. All I do know is that apparently women aren't allowed to have last names in this game. Aggressive Inline is actually really fun, controls really well, and stands right up there with any of the Tony Hawk games. And if you have a GameCube, Xbox, or PS2, it's totally worth checking out. It's a shame it didn't get a sequel, but it's really no surprise that it didn't. Most games that tried to emulate this style of gameplay using other sports never really lasted either, and that's mostly due to the fact that skateboarding is literally the most popular of the extreme sports, and the fact that even it was able to spawn something like the Tony Hawk series was a miracle in and of itself. Sure, they tried to capture the same magic using other sports as the vehicle, and sometimes it worked from a gameplay perspective, but it just didn't have the same kind of draw or staying power. So, since there's already a billion games I'm covering here today, I almost wasn't going to include this one since I've already covered it in another video and I really do not want to replay it. But I figured a nice compromise would be to include the segment I did on Disney Sports Skateboarding years ago, since my opinions on it haven't changed. Only difference is the context since the video topic was different, but here you go, your little time capsule for you.
Now there's a game for the 6th generation of game consoles called Disney's Extreme Skate Adventure. It was built on the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 game engine, and despite being pretty corny and super watered down in terms of content and not as involved when it comes to actual tricks you can do, it's actually a pretty fun little game that feels like a Tony Hawk spin-off. I picked it up used at a GameStop on a whim when I was in my late teens, and I had a pretty fun time with it, a hidden gem in my opinion. This, however, is not that game. This is Disney Sports Skateboarding. It came out about 1 year prior, and it's quite frankly astonishing just how bad it is. Now, there's a nice big old Konami logo on the case, and judging by the overall lack of quality, I thought for sure they must have just published it, but nope, they developed it. Imagine a Tony Hawk's Pro Skater game, only programmed by a 10-year-old whose only experience was making Flash games. And it's very clear they were trying to rip off the Tony Hawk formula because the controls are roughly the same, only mixed up. I was playing the GameCube version, where typically in a Tony Hawk game, A is ollie, B is for flip tricks, Y is for grinds, and X is for grabs. It's basically the same for this, only they've all been swapped around, save for the A button. Like Tony Hawk, the characters have different stats, but of course we're gonna go with Goofy because memes. The stages also have different objectives, also much like Tony Hawk. I'm gonna sound like a broken record here, but it's hard not to draw comparisons when the formula is copied so heavily. What's different about this game, though, is that there's an obnoxious announcer that narrates the entire experience and commentates on everything that happens and gets way too into it. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know who the voice actor is, but it sounds like he did a nice bump in the bathroom prior to entering the vocal booth. Also, sometimes he just says random bullshit, like this part where he for some reason decides it's a good time to do a Jamaican accent.
No need to rush, man.
The game controls like dog shit. I can't for the life of me figure out how to accelerate. I swear it just happens on its own sometimes, and if you hold the ollie button, you just kind of stop moving. If you need to stop abruptly and change directions, it's a chore, and the game just fights you every step of the way. I legitimately could not get past the first stage no matter how many times I tried, although the game did get a little easier to control once I switched to Donald check out my ass duck, so I guess Goofy's stats just didn't lend themselves to overall controllability, but the level in which my enjoyment increased was minimal at best. This game gives you this nice big sandbox to skate in with grindable power lines and randomly placed quarter pipes just like a Tony Hawk game would, but then it takes literally all control away from you. It's like taking your child to a playground, breaking his knees, and then being like, have a blast, kid.
Well, almost 20 years later, and I finally get to talk about my favorite non-Tony Hawk skateboarding game. And the weirdest part is, it wasn't until I started production on this video that I found out it's actually a pseudo-sequel to ESPN X Games Skateboarding. Of course, the ESPN and X Games branding and Bob Burnquist names were dropped, but make no mistake, this is a sequel to that game, and it kind of makes sense considering I thought that ESPN game had some stuff going for it that was ultimately held back by the controls. A lot of the stuff that I thought were good ideas in that game were carried over into this one, called Evolution Skateboarding. When I was a kid, skateboarding with my friends, and everyone was playing the Tony Hawk games, I felt like I found this one hidden game that was almost on par with the Tony Hawk games, and I was the only one who knew about it. My friends who I showed the game ended up hating it, but I think that was due to the controls, which contrasted with the ridiculousness of Tony Hawk physics. This one was just ever so slightly heavier and a little more grounded in reality. It's still ridiculous, but not Tony Hawk ridiculous. Anyway, I picked up the GameCube version used at a GameStop on a whim when I was like 13 or 14, and I ended up loving it. And going back and playing it now, yeah, it definitely still holds up. I think a lot of people's first exposure to this was actually in Metal Gear Solid 2, where you could play a demo of what was actually one level from this game. So, as I said, this game shares a lot of similarities with ESPN X Games skateboarding, but only the parts that had promise. Added its own new ideas while also tightening up the controls into something not only playable this time, but actually pretty fun. Things carried over include nearly all the goals of the previous game, like the sequential checkpoints and hidden collectible, but also carried over are quality of life features like the minimap, which I completely forgot to mention was one of the only redeeming qualities of the previous game. The minimap not only provides a, well, mini-map, but includes a sort of radar for the locations of various goals. This helps out a ton when trying to complete the goals which require you to scour the levels for things like checkpoints or destroyable objects, instead of wasting all your time running around blind. Quite a few pros from the first game make another appearance, so naturally I'm playing as Rick McCrank again, but there's actually reasons to recomplete the game with each character, since not only does doing so unlock a brand new secret character like Snake, Raiden, knockoff Simon Belmont, f***ing Frogger for every single skater on the roster, including the Create a Skater, but the different characters actually all have slightly different level orders, and some have unique stages that other character campaigns don't, and this vastly increases replayability. Oh, and speaking of knockoff Simon Belmont, which in and of itself is funny to me considering this game was literally made by Konami, the game does not take itself seriously at all, and I love it. There's quite a few wacky stages, including ones based on Castlevania, but it's like, Konami did this weird thing where they parodied their own IP in a very on-the-nose way, not a first for them, and it's honestly kind of charming, including some of this game's many boss battles. Yeah, this game has fucking boss battles. See, some, like this giant spider or Dracula, aren't mandatory and are only unique stage goals, but others, like the runaway truck and the tank, are mandatory self-contained boss battle stages. They don't show up on the level selection screen until you beat the previous level, and then they just kind of insert themselves, acting as roadblocks before you can proceed. These bosses aren't too involved and mainly consist of grinding specific weak points, but this is honestly one of the coolest aspects of the game, and it adds some variety in a way that doesn't sidestep too much from the core mechanics. I've said it before, but I actually love when bosses in games use a kind of environmental thing where you need to interact with the stage to defeat them, a la Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr., so this is right up my alley, honestly. Now, like its predecessor, the game still does have that contest mode from X Games Skateboarding, but it's not the main mode this time, and they place the main campaign rightfully at the top of the menu. Beating the contest only awards you some gold medals, which do nothing, so it's kind of pointless to even bother with them. Another new inclusion, which is pretty cool, is this challenge mode, where you need to beat a specific number of challenges, and they increase in difficulty with each tier. These are actually pretty fun. They can get a little frustrating, but I love when games do things like this. It kind of reminds me of the event matches from Super Smash Bros. Melee. Really, my only gripes with this game is the fact that getting an adequate amount of air is kind of difficult sometimes, and despite being almost on par in terms of fun with Tony Hawk games, there's a slight drop in terms of polish. And we once again still can't seem to get a lot of these trick names right, despite filling the roster with pro skaters and having tons of reputable brands featured in the game. And there's some flip tricks that, like 9 times out of 10, pretty much do not work on flat ground, but outside of a few minor issues that I have, not only is this game leagues better than the game that came before it, but it's actually a really fun skateboarding game that tried to do the Tony Hawk thing, and actually, in my opinion anyway, really succeeded. This game is super fun, and I will always recommend it to anyone who hasn't played it. Okay, full disclosure, I couldn't bear to play this piece of shit for more than 45 minutes. I'm sorry. I don't do this all the time, but this one I can't do it. The Simpsons Skateboarding, a broken, nonsensical Tony Hawk clone based in the Simpsons universe. The intro video immediately shows you that the game stars a bunch of characters that you literally can't select and you need to unlock first, so we're off to a good start here. The game is set up very similarly to Tony Hawk 4, where the levels are big and open and you don't have a timer unless you're currently doing a challenge. And since it came out only about a month after Tony Hawk 4, that means it was in development at the same time, which I guess is neat that they both landed on the same kind of structure. The game also looks decent and it's colorful and faithful to the show, and the voice acting is good too, featuring the original voice actors, but that's about where the positives end for this game. The Simpsons Skateboarding has a very limited number of tricks available, which honestly doesn't even matter because the game controls so badly that the number of tricks included is irrelevant. You can't push your way uphill, you can barely turn, half the time you can't actually stop moving, crouching increases ollie height just like in Tony Hawk, but at the expense of not being able to push. So unlike Tony Hawk, where crouching both increases your jump height and speed, you immediately start losing speed if you hold down the ollie button. The game counts flip tricks as late flip tricks unless you press the button input immediately upon jumping, which is annoying for challenges where you need to do specific tricks. And also, grind balance is completely broken and near impossible to control. The goals are similar to your standard Tony Hawk game. Grab a certain number of collectibles, grab letters to spell out a word, but the game makes you do that in order. You can't collect letters out of order even though they're right in front of you. One thing that should be helpful is this arrow pointing you in the direction of your goals, but it only changes if you initiate a challenge. It automatically defaults to the first challenge of each level, which is collecting a certain amount of a level-specific object, but because these are usually broken and eventually lead you to one that's seemingly impossible to collect, you'll probably want to skip that objective, but unfortunately, you can't just choose a different objective to work on. You need to actually find your way to that objective on your own to initiate it, and as soon as you complete it, the arrow defaults right back to that initial objective. I honestly couldn't bear to make it past the second stage. I was fighting the controls the entire time, and you can literally see everything this game has to offer in about 4 minutes of playtime. This is probably one of the worst skateboarding games I've ever played, and it's honestly kind of a shame because the level design and ideas aren't totally terrible, but the controls just don't work. Like, literally, if you just moved all this to any Tony Hawk engine, the game probably wouldn't be half bad. As it stands now, though, it's actually impressive just how fucking terrible it is. If you've been around the whole YouTube gaming thing for a while, you may have heard about a little company called Phoenix Games. They're mostly infamously known nowadays for these budget, Walmart brand knockoff PS2 games based on various properties you'd see from Disney. Their entire business model, taken directly from their mouths in fact, is to rush these games through development and out the door as fast as possible. The company actually prided themselves in making games in a matter of months, and when I say months, I mean single-digit months, just to be clear. Now, these games were not sold in video game stores. No. These were more so along the lines of the budget movies you'd find at various grocery or convenience stores, and much like how those are usually vague knockoffs of existing properties, the games that came out of Phoenix Games were much the same. Also, I should note that this studio only ever released games in Europe, and as such, these shoddy, bootleg, broken games mostly flew under the radar for the rest of the world up until only a few years ago. Now, I was under the impression that they only ever made bootleg games based on existing properties, but I was wrong. Turns out they made a wholly original skateboarding game back in 2007 called Skateboard Madness Extreme Edition, which, unsurprisingly, draws a bit of parallels with the Tony Hawk series. And before you get any ideas, there are no other editions to speak of. Now, don't get it twisted, this is like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater in concept only. In execution, it's a disaster. First of all, you'd literally only know the title of the game if you looked at the game case or disc, because once you boot up the game, there's no title to speak of. No, not even on the title screen. The screen for the title. Now, each stage is split up into 3 parts, or 3 challenges, which each need to be completed within a specific time limit. One where you need to follow and touch each red arrow in order, another where you need to collect these floating skateboards, and a final one where you need to reach a certain high score. These are all hair-pullingly annoying, not out of genuine difficulty, but out of the fact that the controls barely function and the collision is all sorts of f***ed up. It is like pulling teeth just trying to navigate through these levels, and a lot of the times the game just sort of does whatever it wants. A lot of times you'll air out of a quarter pipe, land pretty damn straight, and then you just eat shit anyway. And when that doesn't happen, for whatever reason, like 25% of the time when you launch out of a quarter pipe or anything, you just start spinning for literally no reason with zero agency. When this happens, you once again inevitably eat shit because there's no way to influence your movement to correct your landing. Certain things the game wants you to collect or navigate to a lot of the time are placed in areas where it just makes no sense how you're supposed to reach them. Namely, anytime the game places something at the top of a set of stairs, because there's no way to just easily ollie up them. And half the time you end up crashing into a step and then falling and needing to try again. And there's no way to just ride up to where the game wants you to go. And even though this is designed terribly, it would at least be a little bearable if you could just ollie like normal, but the game makes you crouch and then start accelerating to gain any kind of height. So you need to awkwardly give yourself a head start if you intend to make it to the top. So the game does sort of control like a Tony Hawk game, but just completely broken and missing most tricks. Technically, you can do flip tricks, but it's only heel flips and kick flips, and 90% of the time, the game doesn't even count them. Grinds exist, but I'm pretty sure there's only one grind, and the game calls it slide. Also, it sounds like this. I can't really convey this through speaking, but the balancing makes no sense. The tension the gauge is under is constant, as opposed to it dynamically changing, if that makes sense. Grabs also exist, but you can only do them off ramps, and also, like every trick besides a grind, it seems like the game only counts them when it wants to. So naturally, the only fair way to beat the high score challenges is to find a long ledge to grind and spam grind back and forth, which is pretty easy since the value of tricks don't decrease and it takes no skill or effort to balance long grinds. Problem is, you'll probably rack up the score you need in a matter of a few minutes, and these high score challenges give you 10 of them. You can't just end your run either, so you just kind of need to wait for the timer to run out, which honestly, I would suggest just doing what I did and set your controller down till it's done. Actually, what I'd really suggest is just not playing this game. There's some more stages. I didn't care to see any of them past the second one because who gives a shit? All the objectives stay the same, and after checking out some gameplay of it, apparently there isn't even an actual end to the game. In fact, after each stage is finished, the game tells you that you've unlocked a new stage, and that also goes for literally the final level, and I'm sure you're not going to be surprised to hear that there isn't a secret level. Oh, and I almost forgot, there's a bunch of characters you can pick from to play as, but they all got the same face. Turbo Super Stunt Squad. Once again, not a skateboarding game, or even, well, an extreme sports game at all, but a game that so closely mimics the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater formula that I'd be remiss not to include it. Like I said, I don't want to cover every extreme sports Tony Hawk clone that's ever been created, but this is such a weird one that I feel like I can't not talk about it. Even weirder is that it was released all the way in 2013, way past the heyday of the Tony Hawk series and 2 years before Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 would come out. And how, when needing to make a licensed game based on DreamWorks' Turbo film, they landed on a Tony Hawk's Pro Skater clone is beyond me. They did make a traditional racing game for the Wii, 3DS, and DS, but for whatever reason, when making the PS3, Xbox 360, and Wii U versions, they decided to make a Tony Hawk clone. Minor side note, the Wii U version is also extremely expensive now. Now, I've never seen Turbo. I have no idea what it's about outside of it being about a racing snail, I guess. It always gave me Pixar Cars vibes, and judging by the fact that a lot of these levels take place in areas having to do with food, I'm gonna assume Turbo is Cars meets Ratatouille. I have no other information with which to base my assumption, so just for fun, let me know if what I just said was accurate in the comments. Anyway, where were we? Like I said, this is 100% a shameless Tony Hawk ripoff in the purest sense of the term. The only main difference, really, is that it doesn't control as tightly, it's harder to gain speed in air, and for whatever reason, the jump button and accelerate button are mapped to two different places. Jump is mapped to the bottom face button like an ollie in any Tony Hawk game, but they decided to map accelerate to the right trigger as if this were a racing sim. It's a really strange decision that doesn't do anything to change the way the game plays, and all it really does is disjoint a perfectly tried and true control scheme. It takes some getting used to, but once you start adjusting to it, Turbo's controls otherwise mimic Tony Hawk's pretty much to a T, even when it comes to manuals. The game has multiple snails to choose from along with different options for shells to pick, which I guess is like picking cars in a racing game, but as far as I can tell, it doesn't actually affect your stats and seems to only be cosmetic. Just like the Tony Hawk games, when you select a stage before starting your run, the game will give you a little breakdown of the objectives you have by showing off a little demo video for each, and they're pretty much the same types of things you'd see in a Tony Hawk game. Clear a specific gap, collect all the letters that spell turbo, a la skate letters, high scores, etc. On one hand, these video demos are super helpful because they clearly lay out what your objectives are with a visual demonstration. On the other hand, they're extremely obnoxious because A, you can't skip them, and B, they replay every single time you start a stage, and that includes if you restart a stage. So, with the 3-minute runtime limit, if you start off your run and realize a minute into it that you've wasted too much time to reach your goals, and you want to restart the level to use your time more optimally, you now need to wait for the objective demos to play all over again with no option to skip. This made me want to rip my hair out. Apart from that, though, the game is actually kind of cool. It's not amazing by any means, but it definitely is kinda fun. The stages are all really big and have multiple layers to them as well, with little warp points scattered throughout to take you up to higher levels of the stages. All the level themes are pretty interesting too, for the most part anyway. As I said, a lot of it revolves around restaurant-esque things, but playing as a small character in a human world with big human things is always pretty interesting. It actually reminds me a lot of the Andy's Room level of another Tony Hawk clone, Disney's Extreme Skate Adventure. But that's another one I didn't talk about because it's actually Tony Hawk adjacent, and it runs on the same engine as Tony Hawk 4. I'll say, some of the objectives can get a bit frustrating, as certain spots of certain levels sometimes are easier said than done to get to, mostly due to the controls. It's definitely nowhere near as tight as Tony Hawk, and sometimes the game will give you a gap objective, and the gap is, well, kind of bullshit. Like this one gap in literally the first stage, you're supposed to gap in between these two ramps and over Turbo's bed, but the game doesn't actually give you any run-up or a quarter pipe to build up speed. There is a speed booster on the ground from the ramp before it, and you can boost your way over there, but every time I tried to use it, the trajectory I was on that I had no influence over would make me land directly in the middle of the ramp, making me lose all momentum. I basically just had to trial and error my way over the gap, barely making it when I finally did. In any case, though, for a licensed Tony Hawk clone that most definitely was aimed at a kid demographic, Turbo Super Stunt Squad was actually not half bad, and the Xbox version was pretty cheap. I'd actually honestly recommend giving it a try. I first heard about Skatebird a few years ago, and it honestly seemed pretty promising. There was a decent amount of hype due to the name and premise alone. Clearly the idea for the game was based off of a pun, but the premise was cute and it seemed like actual effort and passion was going into it. A Tony Hawk clone where the main gimmick is that you're a bird skating everyday household items like furniture and old magazines? Count me in. Unfortunately, when it finally did come out in 2021, reception wasn't as high as one would have hoped. Because of this, I just kind of wrote the game off and never tried it. I heard it wasn't good, and then I moved on. It wasn't until making this video that I finally gave the game a shot, and you know what? It's actually a lot worse than I had assumed. This is easily right up there with any of the many Tony Hawk clones that are legitimately bad. First of all, despite having a lot of ridiculous and funny character customization options, including a bird randomizer, the game kinda looks like shit, and the controls match as well. The game is so slow, unresponsive, and unruly to control. That, coupled with the lack of polish that the game has visually, I would not have at all been surprised if you told me this was a $1 budget eShop game. Now, it's one of the many games that are set up similarly to Tony Hawk 4. No time limit when you enter a stage, and you need to skate around looking for objectives by talking to NPC birds that are scattered throughout the stages. Problem is, not only are they not all on the field at once, and many only spawn in after you complete certain challenges, but some don't even disappear once the goal is completed. So sometimes you'll waste your time skating up to a bird just to have it say nothing. Some will have additional challenges, some will disappear once their objective is completed, and some will just stay spawned, all with seemingly no rhyme or reason. These objectives range from collecting letters to getting high scores to some really weird and arbitrary ones, but probably my least favorite has to be the high combo scores. I thought the regular high scores were annoying, but the high combo scores are even more frustrating. See, this game is extremely stingy with the amount of points it gives you for each trick, and this is probably due to the fact that the combo counter isn't based on how many tricks you can string together before properly landing, but rather how many tricks you can do before this meter runs out. Every time you do a trick, it refills. Sometimes all the way, sometimes barely, and I can never seem to figure out how it decides how much it refills because it's sure as hell not based on points. It's only once the meter runs out that you earn the points you've racked up. Problem is, because of this, you can spend your time chaining together tricks with manuals and stalls, but ultimately your points don't count until that meter runs out. Because of this, sometimes you'll spend a bunch of time racking up a score only to bail again after you've already landed because the controls are garbage. Because the game relies on this system to earn a lot of points and not an actual chain system for tricks, you sometimes need to just Hail Mary some random tricks to stop the meter from depleting, and a lot of times you end up eating shit and losing all your points. Now, I played for a couple hours and I did get a few stages in, but I genuinely cannot tell how stages are unlocked. I completed every goal in this one stage and it unlocked nothing. Meanwhile, I only completed some of the objectives in another stage and it unlocked a new one. I cannot, for the life of me, figure out how progression works in this game. The game doesn't tell you, and I'm not looking it up. The writing is also really cringy. I hate using that word, but honestly, it's very dated internet speak and was giving me secondhand embarrassment, which, whatever. If the game was good, I wouldn't care. I don't play skateboarding games for the writing, but that combined with the fact that the game is just straight up not fun to play makes the whole thing collectively worse. I can't even really describe how bad this game feels to play. The controls and camera fight you every step of the way. You constantly get stuck on and stuck in corners, and it's a nightmare just trying to navigate sometimes. I'd expect this of cheap budget eShop garbage, but not a $20 indie game with an actual budget and marketing campaign. The game is not good at all, surprisingly so, and it made me so incredibly frustrated that I began squeezing my controller out of anger, wanting nothing more than to be able to stop playing it. What started out as excitement for a game that looked fun and cute ultimately turned out to be a big fat flaming waste of $6 after getting it on sale, and I still regret having paid for it. Well, I think that's about all I can muster for this one. There's honestly quite a few more if I break my rules, but I think if I was any more thorough, this video would be 10 hours long and it would never come out. But I honestly didn't know what to expect going into this. The only game I really had any experience with was Evolution Skateboarding, and though I've always loved that game, I didn't really have high hopes for any of the other ones, since at the time, games like these started coming out left and right after the success of Tony Hawk, so they mostly seemed like cash grabs, and to be fair, they mostly kind of are. But there's definitely some standout gems here like Aggressive Inline. That game is honestly really great and just as good as any Tony Hawk game, and Grind Session also shocked me. That's absolutely a game I'd recommend to any Tony Hawk's Pro Skater fan. And to my surprise, even Turbo wasn't half bad. Not great, but still pretty fun. As for games like Thrasher Skate and Destroy or MTV Skateboarding or Skatebird, stay far, far away. Unless you like, being angry. Anyway, that about does it for this one. As for me, I think I want a nice solid year before I pick up another skateboarding game. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it and want to see more, there's a couple other videos right there you can check out. And if you want to see everything I do, subscribe and then tap the bell icon. And if you want to help support the channel, I also have a Patreon right there too.